Good morning, Nirit. How are you?
Good morning. It's so good to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well.
Pleasure to have you. I'm wondering if you can give our audience an introduction. I've heard amazing things about you, but this is the first time that I'm meeting you in real time.
Oh, yeah. It's such a pleasure to meet you too. Sure. So I'm Dr. Nirit Gordon, and I'm really excited to be giving the workshop about the CIPOS protocol here at Touchstone, which has been a wonderful home for me. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I'm a psychologist, licensed psychologist in New York, and I've been doing EMDR pretty much since 2016, getting towards a decade, and I love it. I am an EMDR consultant in training, specialized in women's mental health, and my other specialization is trauma and dissociation. And that's very connected to what I'm going to teach because we're going to be talking about how do we deal with dissociation during a session? How do we deal with it within EMDR sessions? How do we recognize it? How can we counter it? And how can we move forward with EMDR when dissociation comes in? And sometimes that can present a lot of challenges.
Yeah. Who exactly would most benefit from this training? Is it the people who are entering the scene of EMDR? Is it the people who have experienced EMDR for quite some time? Who is best served?
What a great question. So, I really deeply feel it's for everyone. So, if you're very experienced with the MDR and you haven't had a chance to really use the CIPOS, use the protocol, it's a great opportunity for you because I think when we think about who's going to benefit, it's whomever is working with dissociation in their offices. And that's all of us. A lot of us who do EMDR work with trauma survivors, and somehow dissociation is ever present. If you're just starting out in EMDR or just starting out at the therapist who's already understood kind of the basic protocol, this is a great opportunity to see how you can use it in a modified version that allows us to do work even when there's a smaller window of tolerance. So if you're losing people to dissociation, they're checking out, disconnecting, and it feels, oh, how can I move forward? How can I really move through all the phases of EMDR when I don't really have them in the room? This is a great opportunity to incorporate into your practice a very grounding tool that still allows you to do phase 3 and 4 of EMDR of the reprocessing.
I love that. So a question that I get from a lot, because I facilitate a lot of foundational, a question that I get from a lot of people just kind of coming into EMDR is they're not sure how to assess. So can you give us some tips about what people should be reading in terms of assessing that dissociation?
Yes, that's such a great question, and we're actually gonna delve into it in the workshop. But basically, I'm talking about the fact that what we learn in school usually, or like for me as a psychologist, I had to like memorize the DSM before I went into my licensing exam. And there in the DSM, we have those few dissociative disorders, full blown disorders, where we have people losing time or feeling far away from themselves, depersonal, or actually have a full dissociative identity disorder. But what we actually encounter in our offices most of the days is something much more subtle and much more nuanced. For example, I sit down with a client and we start talking about something difficult. And suddenly she looks down in the ground like this, then brings her gaze up back and says, oh, what were we talking about? And learning to even start to say, oh, what just happened there? I had a really meaningful session with a new client that something very similar happened. There was this moment of disconnect and return, and then a sense of where am I? Not where am I? Not a, like we said, not a full blown dissociative disorder. Like I don't recognize where I am. But what were we talking about? Where are we in the conversation? And I asked the simple question, what just happened? And she was so moved. She said, I think it's one of the first times in therapy that somebody noticed that I left. And that we call subclinical dissociation, where you don't meet the full criteria of the dissociative disorder, but disconnections that are interrupting our work are happening. So first of all, there are a few questionnaires. One of them we're really gonna get into that. Actually, a very easy one, has only 5 questions, very body-based. So we're gonna get into that in the workshop. And also those kind of small indications of someone leaving, someone disconnecting, dissociating. And we're also gonna talk about how to bring them back, what kind of interventions we know, drawing on somatic experiencing, on polyvagal theory, on parts work. What are the things that we know can invite people back? And in fact, the protocol itself is all about really grounding in the present and coming back to the present. So I hope I answered your questions. I went on. Please help me return.
That's wonderful. And I really appreciate your explaining like this regrounding to the present. I live in a state that gets really cold during the winter. And occasionally I have had to say, walk out onto your porch. And people will say, no, it's snowing. I'll say, it's not what I said. Walk out to your porch. So they'll do it for about 15 seconds so that we can ground them in a way that doesn't necessarily look like calm place, light stream. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you do grounding with people without doing some of those more dissociative leaning exercises.
Wow, what a great question. I love that. So I think just to reiterate what you're saying, when we use calm place or light stream, we're using our imagination, and the resource is our ability to have volition and have choice and disconnect by choice. Whereas dissociation is automatic. It's a mechanism that takes us out of ourself without choice. And I love the example you gave of a person walking out to their porch when it's freezing outside, because that's one big way. That is basically a good example of what is the entryway back. And first and foremost, it is through the senses. And when we think of, for most of us in our trainings, we talked about the window of tolerance. So there's this window that in it, there's an okayness, there's an ability to tolerate. Above it, things are very anxious. There's a lot of looping, there's a lot of fear, like a lot of activation. Where beneath it is more where we meet the dissociation, the numbing, the feel we're coming into ourselves in a way that doesn't allow us to engage with the world. So when we're underneath the window of tolerance, really we need to activate the body, just like you did with your client, which I love. And sometimes when I work virtually, I'll even let's hold your drink, if it's a cold drink or if it's a hot drink. How, like, notice that kind of contact, or really grounding in terms of orientation. So looking around the room and naming 3 things in the room. For us as EMDR therapists, it's really fun to also incorporate the EMDR, so we can invite somebody to say, okay, tell me about 3 things you're seeing right in front of you in the room, but I want you to include something to your right, something in front of you, something to your left. And I would invite anybody watching this who's interested in dissociation to take a moment and really do this with yourself. Kind of say, what are the things I'm seeing? I'm seeing the couch, I'm seeing the window, I'm seeing the shelf, I'm here. By the way, hand on heart and hand on belly is another way of grounding, of coming into the more calm part of our nervous system, more what helps us move into what's more tolerable. As I was mentioning, we have hot and cold in terms of senses. We have naming things in the present, 3 things in the present. Sometimes we also do just naming, we're here together. It's a Thursday. It's 9:30 a.m. Really grounding. Where are we? Where are we right now? So those are just a few examples. Oh, and I also mentioned the hand on heart and hand on belly to return to the body. So coming in through the sensory experience in order to bring us back, to allow us to move forward to do work.
Love that. About what skills you will leave the training with, because I'm so interested in this resource, especially because so many of our clients who have experienced trauma are in whatever the range of dissociation is, from extreme to, I would say, like the highway hypnosis. So, how can I then the skills to best suit my clients?
So I guess you're asking, how do we learn to identify what's going on? Actually, could you say that again?
Yeah,
It will help me ground myself in your question.
I'm thinking about keep this chart by my table that has different depictions of dissociation. And I'm wondering how I can best give skills to my clients, um, to not only recognize the dissociation, but tools that they will use not only in the practice but outside of the practice.
I love that question. I love it. And I think every single tool we use to help ground in the session should be a tool that the person can take with them. So, actually, for me personally, my clients really, for some reason, love more than anything the three things in the room. They say they use it so much outside of the session. I think the first, and we're going to talk about it in the workshop, the first thing we do, of course, is the education. What is dissociation and what does it feel like? The first part we can talk about in theory and what we know from literature and research and what we know from experience that this is an automatic response to when something is too much or too little for too long, right? We say trauma is either overwhelming, it's too much, or too little for too long. So something is very intolerable in the body and it's safer to disconnect from it. And that's something that happens to us without choice. And then the question of how does it come up for every person is a personal question. And I think it's such a beautiful journey to go on with our clients to say, how does it show up for you? Just yesterday, I was in a session and somebody said to me, for me, it's the fact that saying to me specifically, the therapist, when I lose you mid sentence, I constantly get distracted, but it's really about disconnecting from what is being said. Other people might say when we do the EMDR work, suddenly we arrive at the body and we ask, how is the body feeling? And they say, it's fine, it's fine. And when we try to understand what is that fine, is it the answer is nothing, is numbness. For other people, it's really the sense that suddenly I'm really invested, we're having a conversation, whatever it is in session, suddenly I don't care. And in EMDR specifically, it might show up as we started reprocessing, it was available to reprocess, we had a memory come up, another memory, and suddenly there's nothing. There's a wall. No, there's no looping. There's no kind of incessant thought. There's just a nothingness that we get stuck on. And all of these things is really an inquiry we go on with our clients to say, what does it look like for you in your everyday life? Often it's getting more addicted to our phones because we all are, but the moment that it gets harder to stop scrolling, sometimes people say, oh, that's when I'm starting to notice I'm having a harder time being in touch with things. When even though I want to stop scrolling, I feel like I can't, it's pulling me even harder. And of course, it can show up with using other ways of soothing because we don't have access to emotions. We try to soothe ourselves in other ways, like eating, like using substances, all of those. So the idea really is that any skill we do together to ground is one that always the client can take with them outside of the session. And learning what dissociation is and how it shows up for you personally and how it shows up generally in the population. We'll talk about that. But I think our quest is really to be with our clients and learn what it means for them to feel and to notice their dissociation.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, that's really illuminating, especially because some of the clinicians who are EMDR trained don't necessarily have a lot of experience with clients who dissociate. So I think that is such a rich conversation. And I thank you for bringing that to us. So, if I am correct, you are about to do a live training, but also
Right.
have you self paced. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we did our first live training last year, I think. No, it was maybe March. I'm losing time. What is going on? No, just kidding. But we did it once live. We're going to do it live again. There's going to be a lot of practice. So we're actually going to really go through the protocol. The people are going to get the full word by word how to implement it. And then we're going to practice it together. And that's going to be lots of fun. So everybody coming to the workshop, my hope is that you leave it feeling you have a tool in your hand and you know how to use it because you've experienced it on yourself. And then it's going to be recorded and people can move through it self-pace and really practice along. So hopefully it can get to as many people as possible.
I love that, Nirit. Thank you so much for bringing this expertise into our space. I appreciate you and I appreciate what you're providing to our community.
Oh, thanks. And of course, I neglected to say because I feel like a touchstone, it goes without saying that we're going to talk about prenatal periods, postnatal periods, and how that, because that has a lot of conversation with dissociation. Those are periods that are so vulnerable and so heightened, and so much is being asked from our body, from our hearts, from our minds, that there's special challenges there. So of course we're going to touch on that as well and connect the work we do to what it means when we're dealing with these special developmental periods of heightened vulnerability.
I love that. Yeah, that's such a potentially vulnerable time for so many people. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time and I thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Can you tell us about any books or podcasts that you are currently reading? What do you have on your shelf? What can we help ourselves with?
Sure. So I would love to recommend one of my favorite podcasts that's called Notice That, which is an EMDR podcast. And it has specific episodes about specific EMDR issues that I absolutely love. And in connection to CIPOS, it has a whole series about working with ego states, which is part of the foundation of kind of that protocol. So I would love to recommend it. A book I'm reading right now, which I highly recommend for everybody, is Judith Herman's new book, Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice, where she reconceptualizes trauma treatment in relationship to her book, Trauma and Recovery. And she adds another layer of what it means to heal, and that means to receive justice. And what is justice for trauma survivors, and how she redefines it separately from how the legal system defines it, or in relationship to how the legal system defines it. And she really broadens our vision of what true healing and true justice looks like for trauma survivors. So I love her writing. It's a brilliant book. Highly recommend it.
To cart. Can you tell us just a couple tidbits of your thoughts on postnatal, prenatal parts and what that looks like in the realm of dissociation?
As us people who work with people post and prenatal, we know that it's a very special time. If we look at our life's development trajectory, it's a special developmental time. We can even think about it as a growth spurt where we learn so much and we change so much. And also new parts of our internal life are created, like our parent part, our partnering as a parent part. All these different parts suddenly emerge. And for people who hold a history of trauma, sometimes it's can be hard to access different parts of the self when there's so much change, so much pressure, so much transformation in the sense of how we know ourselves. So there we can find more dissociation going on, or dissociation that sometimes is a little more severe than what the person is used to. Maybe they're used to disconnecting a little bit, but right now they feel so disconnected. Some parts of themselves feel out of reach. Sometimes, in a funny way, some parents, I've heard moms say, like, I feel like the mom part has taken over all of me and I can't connect. It's not available for me to reconnect with the part that just enjoys being a partner to my wife or my husband, or just enjoys being on my own, walking down the street alone. It can show up in all kinds of ways, but it's a really special moment in life, and it's special to reconceptualize it when we think about really thinking through and conceptualizing a treatment plan for trauma healing.